In the flickering light of CRT screens and the chaotic pulse of 80s and 90s media, something deeper was at play. Something more than neon colors, synth-pop beats, and over-the-top cartoons. While most people saw nothing more than entertainment, a quieter force was weaving itself into the cultural fabric, slipping past rational thought and embedding itself in the subconscious. A generation grew up surrounded by strange symbols, eyes embedded in pyramids, pentagrams hidden in backdrops, serpents curling through logos, and hands frozen mid-gesture in shapes far older than the pop stars flashing them. Parents screamed, "Satan!" The media laughed, and scholars dismissed it all as coincidence or kitsch. But what if the truth lay somewhere in between? What if those who sounded the alarm during the so-called Satanic Panic weren't entirely delusional, but tapping into a real pattern, one they lacked the language to explain? This wasn't about devil worship. It wasn't about cults in basements or black masses on school grounds. It was about symbols. Ancient, recurring, powerful symbols, suddenly erupting across mainstream culture at a scale never seen before. Music videos became modern rituals. Cartoons echoed initiation myths. Toys mirrored talismans. And while institutions declared it a moral crisis, what really terrified them was the reawakening of a symbolic language that had been buried for centuries. Symbols bypass the rational mind. They speak directly to the soul. And what began to surface in the 80s and 90s wasn't corruption. It was communication. The real secret wasn't that dark forces had taken over culture. The secret was that culture had become a vessel for unconscious archetypes to rise. Something ancient was trying to speak through the noise. And we were too afraid, or too distracted, to listen. But the signs were there, encoded into the shows we watched, the songs we memorized, the games we played. They weren't accidents. They were keys. And now, decades later, the question we must ask isn't, was the panic justified? It's, what were we really being shown? The answer lies not in what they told us to fear, but in what they never wanted us to see. In the early 1980s, a storm of fear swept through the American consciousness. It didn't begin with blood or bodies, but with a creeping sense that something dark was infiltrating the culture. Parents watched in confusion as their children became obsessed with heavy metal bands, strange fantasy games, horror films, and cartoons that seemed to carry unfamiliar messages. Preachers warned from pulpits, tabloid talk shows amplified the threat, and self-styled experts issued dire warnings. Satanism was on the rise. Cults were allegedly operating in quiet suburbs. Children were being indoctrinated through music and media. Ritual abuse was hidden in daycares and secret symbols lurked in everyday products. These claims, though often unsubstantiated, were deeply compelling because they tapped into something primal, the fear that innocence was being corrupted from within. This moral panic, later known as the Satanic Panic, was fueled by a perfect storm of social and psychological conditions. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s had unraveled traditional religious authority and moral structures. The rise of television, home video, and rock music gave younger generations unprecedented access to images, sounds, and messages that bypassed parental filters. Simultaneously, the United States was gripped by rising crime rates, economic instability, and geopolitical uncertainty. In this environment of anxiety and cultural fragmentation, the search for a scapegoat was inevitable. The narrative of an invisible satanic enemy provided a compelling story, one that explained the unease many people felt but couldn't articulate. It gave the chaos a face, a shape, and a name. And more importantly, it gave institutions a way to reassert control. Much of the hysteria centered around a handful of high-profile cases and media moments. In 1980, the book Michelle Remembers became a bestseller, detailing alleged recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse. Though later debunked, the book was treated as factual by many law enforcement agencies and therapists. Daycare workers were accused of unspeakable acts based on dubious testimony and suggestive interviews with children. The McMartin preschool trial, one of the most notorious examples, dragged on for years and cost millions of dollars, yet resulted in no convictions. Meanwhile, television amplified the panic. Programs like 2020, Geraldo, and Oprah hosted experts and survivors who spoke of secret cults, blood rituals, and encoded messages in popular media. Police seminars trained officers to spot alleged satanic symbols and rituals. Churches held burnings of music albums and Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks. In less than a decade, an entire infrastructure of paranoia had formed. What's important to understand is that the fear was not entirely fabricated. It was misguided, yes, and it often targeted the wrong people. But it was rooted in the recognition that something had shifted. The children of the 80s and 90s were growing up in a media landscape unlike anything seen before. The speed, intensity, and visual saturation of culture had transformed. Music videos blended surreal imagery with sexual and violent undertones. Horror movies explored demonic possession and occultism in explicit detail. Fantasy role-playing games immersed players in worlds of magic, monsters, and ancient gods. Even seemingly benign cartoons invoked cosmic battles, magical weapons, and transformation rituals. To a generation of adults raised on linear morality and literal faith, this felt like spiritual warfare. And in some ways, it was. But not in the way they thought. The panic was not merely an overreaction to symbols. It was a response to a symbolic rupture. For centuries, religious institutions had maintained a monopoly on sacred language. They defined what symbols meant, who had access to them, and how they could be used. But in the rapidly evolving media ecosystem of the 80s, those same symbols, pentagrams, serpents, third eyes, magic circles, were being democratized and recontextualized. They were appearing not on altars or in grimoires, but on lunchboxes, arcade screens, and rock stages. This represented a profound loss of control for institutional religion. It wasn't just about Satan. It was about the decentralization of spiritual power. The panic, then, was not just hysteria. It was resistance. It's also critical to note how the panic targeted youth culture specifically. Teenagers and children were positioned as both victims and vectors, innocent minds to be protected, and potential gateways for evil influence. This double narrative allowed institutions to play both savior and enforcer. Schools implemented censorship policies. Churches intensified youth outreach programs. Politicians called for stricter regulation of media content. Meanwhile, artists and creators often leaned into the controversy, using the language of the forbidden to generate intrigue and rebellion. The more they were accused, the more powerful the symbols became. The Eye of Providence, the goat-headed Baphomet, the inverted cross, all took on new layers of meaning. They were no longer just religious symbols. They were icons of cultural insurgency, points of contact between the sacred and the profane, the feared and the misunderstood. Despite the lack of evidence for organized satanic cults engaging in widespread ritual abuse, the panic had lasting consequences. Innocent people were jailed. Children were traumatized. Trust in media, institutions, and even memory itself was shaken. And yet, beneath the chaos, something else was happening. Symbols long buried or demonized were returning. Not because of a hidden conspiracy, but because the collective psyche was reaching for them. The panic, in its misguided fervor, revealed that these symbols still had power, still evoked something primal, mysterious, and transformative. The problem wasn't that the symbols existed. It was that no one remembered how to read them. In the end, the Satanic Panic wasn't a lie. It was a misdiagnosis. It was the rational mind's attempt to explain a symbolic awakening using the only language it had: fear. It mistook transformation for corruption. It interpreted archetype as attack. But in doing so, it pointed, perhaps unknowingly, toward a deeper truth. That culture was shifting on an energetic level. That the sacred was returning through unexpected channels. And that the old structures were no longer sufficient to contain the rising tide of myth, image, and meaning. The panic tried to close the door, but it only drew more attention to what lay behind it. And now, decades later, the door remains open, waiting to be entered, not with fear, but with understanding. As the 1980s unfolded, a quiet revolution was taking place within the framework of global culture, one not driven by politics or religion, but by imagery, sound, and the mythic architecture of the human psyche. What emerged during this time was not simply a new form of entertainment, but an entirely new symbolic operating system. From the sound waves of synth-heavy pop to the flashing animations of Saturday morning cartoons, culture began to speak in a language older than any nation-state or institution, a language rooted in archetype, alchemy, and initiation. This was not the result of a singular conspiracy, but the consequence of an unconscious return of the repressed. Symbols that had once been confined to secret societies, mystical texts, and ancient temples were suddenly appearing in mass media, often unnoticed, often disguised, but always charged with meaning. The so-called Satanic Panic, was in part a blind reaction to this deeper phenomenon, the re-emergence of the occult blueprint in popular culture. To understand this blueprint, one must first understand that occult symbols are not merely ornamental. They are metaphysical tools, charged glyphs designed to awaken, align, or disrupt energetic patterns in the observer. The pentagram, the all-seeing eye, the serpent, the double cross, the cube, the spiral. These are not random decorations. They are visual sigils connected to systems of initiation, transformation, and cosmic balance. Their recurrence in esoteric traditions across cultures is not coincidental. It reflects their universal resonance within the structure of consciousness itself. In the pre-modern world, these symbols were reserved for initiates, encoded within the language of alchemy, astrology, Kabbalah, and sacred geometry. Their power lay not just in their form, but in their use. Ritual, repetition, intent. By the 1980s, those ancient frameworks were largely forgotten or dismissed by mainstream society. But the symbols remained, dormant in the collective unconscious, waiting for a new medium to express themselves. Pop culture became that medium. Through television, film, music, and fashion, the archetypal language began to speak again. Not through monks or magicians, but through animators, set designers, lyricists, and video editors. Many of these creators were not consciously aware of the deeper meaning behind their aesthetic choices. They were inspired by dreams, intuition, and the visual vocabulary inherited from earlier generations of artists and mystics. But others, especially within the avant-garde and counterculture scenes, knew exactly what they were doing. They saw in mass media a new ritual space, a global temple of light and sound capable of initiating millions at once. Take, for instance, the music video, a format that exploded in popularity with the rise of MTV in 1981. These short visual spectacles combined narrative, symbolism, choreography, and audio frequency into a multi-sensory experience resembling ancient ritual theater. Artists such as Madonna, Michael Jackson, David Bowie, Prince, and later Nine Inch Nails and Tool created videos filled with alchemical and esoteric references. The recurring use of checkerboard floors, Masonic symbolism, sun and moon dualities, rebirth imagery, sacred geometrical backdrops, masked figures, and inverted crosses was not arbitrary. It echoed the visual language of initiation, death and rebirth, veiling and unveiling, descent and ascent. When Madonna performed rituals on stage dressed as a priestess, or when Bowie embodied androgynous avatars of transformation, they were channeling the ancient mythic impulse through modern technology. The blueprint extended beyond music into film. Directors such as Stanley Kubrick, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Jim Henson constructed cinematic worlds that blended science fiction and fantasy with myth, psychology, and hidden spiritual principles. Star Wars was not just a space opera. It was a symbolic journey of the hero, the fool turned initiated, guided by an inner force, tempted by shadow, destined for transcendence. Labyrinth, The Dark Crystal, Indiana Jones, and The Last Crusade. These were not just stories. They were modern versions of the old mystery plays, retold with lasers and latex. Even horror films such as The Exorcist, Hellraiser, and The Omen played with Christian and occult symbols, not simply to scare, but to provoke a reaction deeper than conscious fear, a response to the sacred desecrated or the profane sanctified. Children's entertainment was no exception. In fact, it may have been the most symbolically potent of all. Animated series like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Thundercats, Transformers, and Sailor Moon featured cosmic battles between light and dark, initiation sequences, magical transformations, talismanic weapons, and mythic archetypes thinly veiled behind consumer branding. Characters invoked power through sacred words. Symbols flashed during transformation sequences. Planets aligned. Portals opened. These were not accidents. Whether intentionally or intuitively, the creators of these series were embedding occult structures into the narratives consumed by millions of impressionable minds. The repetition of these patterns in early childhood programming laid symbolic frameworks in the subconscious, frameworks that would remain dormant until triggered later in life by similar archetypal content. Meanwhile, the world of fashion and advertising began appropriating esoteric symbols for aesthetic appeal. Brands and designers began to incorporate occult motifs, pentacles, third eyes, Egyptian iconography, serpents, and occult numerology, into clothing, jewelry, and product packaging. Logos were designed using sacred geometry, hidden symmetries, and numerological balances that evoked a subconscious response. The triangle, the eye, the hexagon, the spiral. These forms reappeared with increasing frequency, often without explanation. This was not inherently sinister. In many cases, it was the unconscious mind of the designer drawing from the archetypal well, but the effect was the same. A saturation of the cultural field with symbols once reserved for secret ritual and sacred transmission. What makes the occult blueprint of pop culture so significant is not simply its presence, but its scale and intensity. Never before had so many symbolic triggers been broadcast to so many people, across so many platforms, with such emotional and aesthetic charge. The images came wrapped in pleasure, rebellion, fantasy, and identity. They bypassed rational skepticism and embedded themselves in memory and emotion. Viewers didn't just see the symbols, they danced to them, wore them, drew them, and identified with them. The culture became a self-running initiation chamber, with no master of ceremonies, no declared purpose, and no clear endpoint. This explosion of occult imagery in pop culture was not inherently evil, but it was powerful, and power, when untethered from context, becomes dangerous. Without guidance or initiation, the flood of archetypal imagery can overwhelm, confuse, or distort. The Satanic Panic may have misunderstood the content, but it correctly intuited the energetic magnitude of what was occurring. Something ancient was returning through the image. Something long buried was speaking again through the glowing screen. And for those unable to interpret the message, fear became the only available reaction. The occult blueprint was not a conspiracy. It was an echo, a dream within the dream of the culture, rising to the surface as the modern world began to crack under the weight of its own denial. It was the return of the sacred in a time that had forgotten how to honor it. And those symbols, scattered across albums, games, shows, posters, and clothing, were not spells cast upon us. They were messages sent to us, not to enslave, but to awaken. Nowhere was the occult blueprint more visible or more culturally potent than in the music industry. From the early days of heavy metal to the rise of global pop icons, music became the primary vessel through which esoteric symbolism entered the mainstream. It was through music videos, stage performances, album covers, and lyrics that an entire generation was introduced to sigils, mythic archetypes, and spiritual metaphors without ever stepping inside a church or a lodge. In the 1980s and 1990s, artists were no longer simply entertainers. They became living avatars of transformation, channeling hidden energies and embedding ancient language into mass consciousness through rhythm, sound, and visual spectacle. This was not incidental. Music, as one of the oldest ritual forms, has always served as a bridge between worlds. And in the hyper-mediated age of television and VHS, that bridge was extended into every household on Earth. Heavy metal was one of the earliest genres to embrace and amplify occult aesthetics. Bands like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Iron Maiden, Slayer, and later Marilyn Manson did more than adopt dark themes for shock value. They reintroduced the aesthetics of ritual, death, and shadow into the cultural lexicon. Black Sabbath's early lyrics spoke of sorcery, apocalyptic visions, and esoteric fear. Their music opened the floodgates for an entire wave of performers who drew openly from satanic and mystical imagery. Iron Maiden's use of Egyptian and Christian symbols, combined with songs like The Number of the Beast, brought numerology and biblical prophecy into heavy rotation on radio and in teenage bedrooms. Slayer's pentagrams, Manson's inverted crosses, and Tool's sacred geometry transformed concerts into symbolic ceremonies, complete with visual elements and iconography sourced directly from occult and alchemical traditions. But this phenomenon was not confined to the heavy metal underground. Pop music also absorbed and repurposed esoteric codes with surprising depth. Artists like David Bowie were pioneers in this regard. Bowie's various alter egos, Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, Aladdin Sane, functioned as archetypes, personas constructed through a blend of Kabbalah, astrology, sci-fi futurism, and shamanic performance art. Ziggy Stardust's descent to Earth and eventual annihilation is not just a glam rock narrative. It is an alchemical allegory. Bowie openly referenced Aleister Crowley and was deeply influenced by Gnostic and Hermetic philosophies. His lyrics and visuals often hinted at initiation, duality, and the divine spark hidden within human madness. Madonna's transformation from pop ingenue to occult priestess is another telling example. Her 1990 Blonde Ambition tour featured Kabbalistic symbols, crucifixion motifs, and choreographed rituals that blurred the lines between sacred and profane. Her use of Catholic imagery, inverted to provoke and awaken, was not simply rebellion. It was a kind of symbolic reconfiguration, a dance between light and shadow, designed to stir subconscious tension. In later years, her work increasingly referenced mysticism, even adopting elements from the Kabbalah Center and incorporating Hebrew letters into album artwork. She became not only a provocateur, but a cultural sorceress, manipulating symbol and sound to provoke transformation, whether superficial or deeply internal. Michael Jackson, too, consciously or unconsciously tapped into the symbolic field. From the Eye of Horus in his costumes to pyramid motifs and solar alignments in his stage design, Jackson crafted himself as a messianic figure, combining myth, spectacle, and prophecy. His videos often portrayed spiritual struggle, redemption, and transformation through archetypal imagery. Remember the Time invokes Egyptian myth. Black or white plays with polarity and unity. Even his infamous military-style outfits, adorned with badges, braids, and armbands, echoed Masonic and occult ceremonial garb. His persona was more than celebrity. It was ritual. The rise of MTV intensified this phenomenon. Music videos became compressed symbolic transmissions, 3 to 5 minute visual incantations filled with subliminal imagery and metaphoric storytelling. These videos were not just promotional tools, they were portals. The blend of sound, motion, rhythm, and image created a kind of modern-day rite, where the viewer became a participant, drawn into the symbolic unfolding without conscious awareness. Repetition played a key role. Sigils, when repeated, gain power. The constant replay of music videos, many with esoteric symbols embedded in frames, transitions, and choreography, functioned like modern spellcraft. The viewer became the vessel. Pop culture during this era also witnessed the mainstreaming of occult terminology. Words like karma, aura, hex, vibe, and ritual entered everyday language. Artists sang about resurrection, demons, heaven and hell, angels and gods, concepts stripped of religious context but saturated with archetypal charge. The sacred was no longer confined to temples or scriptures. It was danced out in clubs, whispered through lyrics, and blasted from car speakers. Even bands like U2 incorporated biblical and mystical themes into their music, especially in albums like Achtung Baby, where duality, apocalypse, and salvation became lyrical themes. The visual design of albums deserves its own analysis. Vinyl covers, cassette jackets, and later CD inserts became shrines to symbolic art. Pink Floyd's Prism, the Ouroboros, the triple goddess symbol, the Vesica Piscis, all appeared, sometimes stylized, sometimes hidden. Tool's album Lateralis used Fibonacci sequences and sacred geometry. Nirvana's In Utero featured anatomical and angelic figures in disturbing fusion. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were archetypal broadcasts. The youth who stared at these images while listening to lyrics about suffering, transcendence, addiction, and awakening were engaging in symbolic consumption, absorbing rituals through repetition and resonance. Hip-hop also evolved into a symbolic battlefield. While early hip-hop focused on social commentary, artists in the 90s like Tupac Shakur, Nas, and later Jay-Z and Kanye West incorporated esoteric references, numerology, biblical prophecy, and Illuminati symbology. Tupac's repeated references to dying young, reincarnation, and prophetic destiny made him into a mythic figure, a martyr archetype. Jay-Z's use of pyramid symbols and rock hand signs created a visual language that sparked conspiracy theories, but also revealed an underlying truth, that these artists understood, intuitively or otherwise, the power of image to shape perception. Kanye's transformation from college dropout to self-declared messiah was steeped in apocalyptic symbolism, sacred iconography, and antinomian performance. The rapper as prophet, the concert as church, the beat as invocation. All of this converged to create an unprecedented saturation of esoteric symbolism in mainstream music. Whether driven by occult intent, artistic experimentation, or unconscious archetypal expression, the result was the same. A cultural environment where the sacred returned through sound and spectacle. And while moral guardians denounced it as demonic, and conspiracy theorists screamed about hidden hands, few paused to ask why these symbols resonated so deeply in the first place. Why did so many artists, across genres and geographies, reach for the same symbols? Why did their audiences respond with such fervor, confusion, fear, and awe? The answer may lie not in malice or manipulation, but in the return of myth. The modern world, divorced from mystery, began to remember itself through melody and image. The music industry became a cathedral of symbols, its performers high priests and tricksters, its stage a ritual ground. For a generation starved of soul, this was the only church left. And though the symbols may have been misunderstood, they carried with them the echo of something ancient, powerful, and undeniable, the sound of spirit breaking through the noise. While the music industry cast esoteric symbols in sound and spectacle for adolescent and adult audiences, it was the world of children's media, cartoons, toys, and games, that became the most unguarded and symbolically potent sphere of influence. In the 1980s and 1990s, a wave of fantastical programming exploded onto television screens, often tied directly to elaborate toy lines and merchandise campaigns. But these shows were more than commercial content. They carried archetypal structures, mythic narratives, and visual symbolism that echoed ancient spiritual systems with startling precision. What appeared on the surface to be innocent entertainment was, in truth, a complex tapestry of initiation, ritualistic transformation, sacred weaponry, and metaphysical duality. The ritual of play, so often dismissed as trivial, became a hidden arena for the transmission of forgotten symbolic knowledge. Shows like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Thundercats, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Transformers, Power Rangers, and Sailor Moon dominated after-school and weekend television programming. Each one followed a strikingly similar formula. An ordinary character or team discovers a secret power, undergoes a symbolic transformation, receives magical weapons or sacred objects, and battles forces of darkness in a cyclical, often metaphysical, war. These aren't just adventure plots, they're initiatory myths repackaged for mass consumption. He-Man, for instance, features Prince Adam who, upon raising the Sword of Power and uttering a ritual phrase, "By the power of Grayskull," transforms into a higher version of himself. This sequence mirrors classic initiation rites, the ceremonial invocation, the sacred object, and the alchemical transformation into an illuminated being. Grayskull itself is a cryptic blend of grave and skull, suggesting the underworld, death, and the passage through darkness into light, a theme found in countless mystery traditions. Thundercats follows a similar arc. A group of feline humanoids, each associated with a symbolic trait, navigates the battle between order and chaos. The central weapon, the Sword of Omens, not only grants power, but also sight beyond sight, a clear parallel to the activation of the third eye or higher consciousness. Lion-O, the protagonist, undergoes a trial of growth and maturity, which is not only physical, but deeply spiritual. In Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, 4 beings born from mutation and trained by a wise Eastern-coded master live beneath the surface of the city, hidden, symbolic of the subconscious. Each turtle is named after a Renaissance figure and is color-coded, suggesting the alchemical elements or chakras. They surface only to engage with dark forces, a metaphor for the inner self emerging to confront externalized shadow forms. These shows were not isolated phenomena. Across the landscape of animated content, a pattern emerges. Secret realms, magic words, sacred geometry and background designs, solar and lunar alignments, characters who undergo death and rebirth, and constant themes of hidden knowledge, lost, civilizations, cosmic balance, and moral polarity. Even shows aimed at younger audiences, such as Care Bears, My Little Pony, and Rainbow Bright, encode light versus dark narratives, beams of energy representing will and emotion, and talismanic tokens or colors that correspond to emotional states and symbolic meaning. But perhaps even more significant than the shows themselves were the physical objects that accompanied them, the toys. These were not passive props, but participatory artifacts. Children didn't just watch their heroes, they became them through ritualized play. Swords, amulets, action figures, spellbooks, transformation wands. These toys were handled, spoken to, given names and personalities. They were arranged in battle formations, used in mock invocations, subjected to cycles of defeat and resurrection. Play, when understood through an esoteric lens, is not idle. It is formative. It is ritual performed without the burden of conscious dogma. When a child lifts a sword, and recites a phrase of power, even in imitation, they are participating in a symbolic script far older than they understand. They are enacting rites, assigning energy to forms, and embodying archetypes. In many mystery schools of the ancient world, symbolic reenactment was the foundation of initiatory experience. The difference is that now the temples were bedrooms and backyards. Games like Dungeons & Dragons extended this participatory ritual into adolescence. The structure of the game mimics spiritual initiation, the formation of a group or fellowship, the descent into unknown realms, the use of symbolic tools, the confrontation with shadow entities, and the return with gained wisdom or treasure. Each campaign is a journey through layered realities. The Dungeon Master assumes the role of cosmic architect, not unlike a demiurge, while the players develop avatars that must evolve, gain knowledge, and survive tests. Though vilified during the Satanic Panic, the power of this format lies precisely in its flexibility. It allows the imagination to interact with mythic structures in an embodied way, blurring the line between game and ritual. Even board games, trading card games like Magic, The Gathering, and early video games contributed to this symbolic ecosystem. Players engaged with archetypes of warrior, mage, healer, summoner, roles drawn directly from ancient systems of personality typology and spiritual archetypes. In Magic, The Gathering, the 5 colors of mana correspond to elemental forces, ethical dispositions, and mystical alignments, constructing a playable cosmology that requires strategic invocation and balance. The cards themselves feature sigils, incantations, and artwork steeped in hermetic and mythological iconography. Though designed as games, these experiences function as microcosmic worlds, where the subconscious can interact with symbolic forms and test its understanding through structured play. The result of this cultural saturation was the construction of a symbolic language shared across an entire generation. Children and teenagers exposed to these symbols, patterns, and narratives learned to think in terms of transformation, hidden realms, and unseen forces. They internalized the idea that there was more to the world than meets the eye, that beneath the surface of ordinary life was a deeper pattern, one that could be accessed through courage, intuition, and will. Whether they realized it or not, they were being initiated, not by clergy or mystics, but by culture itself. The great irony is that while traditional religions lamented the loss of spiritual depth among the youth, the spiritual experience had simply migrated. The temple became the television. The altar became the toy shelf. The sacred ritual became the afternoon cartoon lineup. This hidden curriculum of initiation did not necessarily produce a generation of occultists, but it did lay a foundation for spiritual seeking. The symbols planted in early life often resurfaced later, triggering questions and quests for meaning. Why did the same patterns appear in different shows? Why did certain shapes and colors evoke such strong feelings? Why did playing certain roles feel transformative? The cultural landscape of the 80s and 90s didn't offer answers, it offered invitations, and for those who accepted them, the ritual of play became the first step toward awakening. The children of that era were not corrupted by toys and cartoons. They were called. And some, decades later, are still answering. The presence of recurring symbols, metaphysical patterns, and ritualistic structures across music, television, games, and toys during the 1980s and 1990s inevitably leads to one question. Was it intentional? Was there a hidden hand orchestrating the symbolic saturation of mass culture, embedding occult references in plain sight to manipulate or initiate the public? Or were these symbols simply rising naturally from the collective unconscious, surfacing through the creative process of artists, designers, and storytellers who had no conscious knowledge of the traditions they were echoing? The answer is not binary. It exists in the liminal space where both possibilities coexist, a space that defies modern frameworks of conspiracy or coincidence, and asks us to examine the deeper layers of cultural reality. In this chapter, we explore the tension between intentional design and archetypal inevitability, between control and emergence, between conscious manipulation and subconscious expression. On one end of the spectrum, it's undeniable that some artists, directors, and producers had a working knowledge of esoteric systems. Individuals like David Bowie, Madonna, and Alan Moore have openly acknowledged their engagement with occult literature, ceremonial magic, and symbolic philosophy. Others, including set designers, animators, and game developers, were part of secret societies such as the Freemasons or Rosicrucians, or were deeply influenced by theosophy, alchemy, and New Age ideologies. Their creative output was not random. It was encoded. The use of sigils, color schemes, geometrical alignments, mythic structures, and metaphysical references was not merely aesthetic. It served a purpose. Some used these elements to challenge religious orthodoxy. Others sought to awaken dormant aspects of the psyche. And yes, some may have used them for influence and control. But to reduce all symbolic usage in pop culture to manipulation is to miss the larger point. Symbols are not owned by any one group. They belong to the human soul. And when the culture is ripe, they return. This brings us to the other end of the spectrum. Emergence. The theory of archetypal currents suggests that symbols do not always originate from conscious choice. They arise organically, especially during times of cultural upheaval and transformation. Carl Jung described archetypes as universal patterns of thought, behavior, and imagination that reside within the collective unconscious. When individuals create art, music, stories, or systems, they often draw from this collective well, whether or not they realize it. These symbols carry an energetic charge, a gravitational pull that guides human behavior and perception. The eye, the serpent, the cross, the tree, the spiral. These shapes and stories are not inventions. They are discoveries. They are constellations of meaning that form naturally when the human mind attempts to make sense of chaos and seek wholeness. During the 80s and 90s, the Western world was experiencing a deep existential shift. The Cold War, the rise of technology, the disintegration of traditional religious authority, and the explosion of global media created a crisis of identity and meaning. In response, the psyche began to produce symbols, through art, music, fantasy, and play, that could express what could not yet be spoken. The reemergence of the occult in mass media was, in part, a subconscious adaptation to spiritual starvation. Institutional religion had failed to speak to the complexities of the modern psyche. Political ideologies were collapsing. Science offered answers, but no depth. The archetypes stepped in to fill the void. They came not to deceive, but to remind. And they did so through whatever channels were available. The radio, the television, the arcade machine, the paperback novel. To call this phenomenon accidental is equally inaccurate. Archetypes are not accidental. They are precise. They surface at exact moments in history when the psyche is ready to engage them. They do not need to be summoned by secret societies. They emerge naturally from the evolutionary pressures of the soul. But that does not mean they are without consequence. Archetypes are volatile forces. They carry light and shadow. Misunderstood, they can lead to fanaticism, delusion, or control. Integrated, they can catalyze awakening, healing, and transformation. This is why mystery schools existed in the first place, to provide frameworks for safely engaging these forces. When the symbols are released without guidance, they can overwhelm. The Satanic Panic was, in part, a collective immune response to this unstructured symbolic emergence. It mistook the medicine for the poison, the key for the threat. This raises a profound insight. Perhaps the danger was never in the symbols themselves, but in their uninitiated reception. When sacred symbols are removed from their contexts, when the Eye of Providence becomes a logo, when the pentagram becomes a fashion trend, when the serpent becomes a cartoon villain, their deeper meaning is lost, but their power remains. The psyche still responds. Children still dream. Adults still fear. But without the rituals, the teachings, the interpretive frameworks, these symbols float freely, activating forces without integration. The danger is not in the occult. The danger is in forgetting what the occult was originally designed to do. Reveal, not obscure. Initiate, not deceive. Awaken, not control. So was there a hidden hand? In some cases, yes. But the larger truth is that the archetypal current itself is the hidden hand. It moves through individuals, through systems, through symbols, through sound and story and structure. It is not inherently malevolent or benevolent. It is potential, and like any potential, it reflects the intent of its wielder. What the Satanic Panic failed to grasp is that symbols are not inherently evil, they are mirrors. What they show depends on who is looking, and what remains unseen within them. The cultural guardians of the time responded with suppression because they lacked interpretation. They could recognize the potency of the symbols, but had no language to understand them, no context to integrate them, and no ritual to contain their impact. This is the core of the modern dilemma. We live in a world where symbols still move us, still shape our dreams and fears, yet we are illiterate in the language they speak. And that illiteracy makes us vulnerable, not to the symbols themselves, but to those who would use them without wisdom. The answer is not censorship. It is initiation. The solution is not to ban the symbols, but to teach their meanings. Only through symbolic literacy can we reclaim our sovereignty, our psychic wholeness, and our place within the mythic field. As we approach the threshold of a new era, one marked by artificial intelligence, immersive media, and quantum consciousness, the symbols will only become more powerful. They will appear in augmented realities, in neural interfaces, in simulations indistinguishable from dreams. The archetypal current is not retreating, it is evolving. The question is whether we will meet it with ignorance or understanding, with fear or reverence. For in every symbol lies a choice, to repeat the unconscious cycle, or to awaken. And the first step to awakening is not to believe or disbelieve the symbol, but to look into it and see ourselves. The forbidden truth, the one buried beneath decades of panic, propaganda, denial, and distraction, is not that hidden symbols were embedded into the culture of the 1980s and 1990s. That much is obvious to anyone with eyes trained to see. The forbidden truth is that those symbols were never meant to enslave. They were meant to awaken. The panic that gripped families, congregations, and institutions across the Western world misinterpreted the reemergence of occult imagery as evidence of a sinister agenda. But beneath the fear was a deeper current, an ancient language attempting to resurface through the only channels left open: music, media, toys, and games. The symbolic eruption that marked this era was not a cultural infestation. It was a call from the unconscious, a mass initiation hidden in plain sight, dressed in neon, animated in cell frames, encoded in vinyl grooves and cathode ray static. The truth they feared is the same truth they tried to bury, that the sacred was never gone. It had just changed form. When the traditional guardians of meaning, religion, academia, and philosophy, failed to nourish the collective soul, the archetypes found new hosts. Pop stars became avatars, fiction became scripture, childhood play became ritual. The eye of providence blinked from dollar bills and music videos, not as a symbol of global domination, but as an ancient sigil of awakening that the collective had forgotten how to interpret. The inverted cross, the pentagram, the rising phoenix, the black sun, the Ouroboros, the broken mirror. These were not instruments of evil, but metaphors for cycles of transformation, of descent and return, of ego death and rebirth. And like all true symbols, they did not belong to any one system or ideology. They are the property of the psyche itself, always waiting, always watching, always ready to speak when the moment is ripe. The panic came not because the symbols were false, but because they were real, too real. They triggered ancient recognition in the unconscious, fear in those who had lost their initiatory paths, wonder in those who felt their mystery, and rage in those who had built entire institutions on the premise that all truth must be mediated through external authority. To acknowledge that the sacred could speak through a comic book, a guitar riff, or a fantasy game was to admit that the soul needs no gatekeepers. It was to confront the terrifying possibility that initiation can come through chaos, that transformation might arrive without permission, and that the divine might appear in a form you were told to fear. The real war of the Satanic Panic was not a battle against devil worship. It was a war on the imagination, a last-ditch effort to maintain control over the sacred by pathologizing every symbol not sanctioned by the orthodoxy. And yet, the imagination refused to be controlled. It adapted. It whispered. It encoded. It reappeared in graffiti and dance, in poetry and film, in the hidden geometry of a toy and the whispered chant of a playground game. The forbidden truth is that a generation was not corrupted by these symbols. They were initiated by them. They were shown a mirror that religion had long since shattered, a mirror that reflected not satanic influence, but the fragmented image of their own divinity. The true danger of symbols is not in their presence but in their power to liberate perception. A single glyph can unlock memory, dismantle fear, or trigger transformation. That is why mystery schools guarded them so closely, and that is why institutions reacted with such violence when those symbols resurfaced outside the boundaries of approved ritual. The mass media of the 80s and 90s was chaotic, messy, and sometimes manipulative. But it was also a psychic arena where ancient archetypes returned, not to destroy innocence, but to challenge stagnation. When a child shouted a magic phrase to become a superhero, they were reenacting the oldest myth. When an artist used a stage to simulate death and rebirth, They were embodying an alchemical process as old as fire. When a teenager stared into the eye on an album cover and felt something awaken inside, they were touching a part of the symbolic field that defied explanation and could not be forgotten. What was forbidden was not the symbol. It was the capacity to interpret it freely. The structures of control needed fear to maintain authority. But fear only works when people are kept blind. The moment one understands that a symbol does not dictate truth but opens it, the chains fall. Interpretation is the true revolution. And the ability to decode one's reality, to see the hidden grammar of dreams and myths embedded in the waking world, is what makes one sovereign. That's the truth that institutions could not allow. That's why the panic had to happen. It was not a defense against evil. It was a firewall against spiritual literacy. And yet, the symbols survived. They were ridiculed, banned, misunderstood, and repurposed. But they survived. Because symbols do not need belief. They need recognition. They wait like seeds in the psyche, dormant until the conditions are right. And now those seeds are growing again. People are beginning to question the old narratives. They are returning to the texts once labeled heretical. They are remembering that power and evil are not the same thing. That rebellion is not inherently wrong. That transformation often begins with confusion, darkness, and dissent. The archetypes are alive. The forbidden is remembered. And the truth is no longer silent. What lies ahead is not another panic, but a choice. The symbolic language that once came through vinyl and VHS is now flowing through digital streams, immersive realities, and global networks. The medium has changed. The message has not. It still speaks of awakening. It still points inward. It still says, look deeper. Look beyond the surface. Remember who you are. The forbidden truth is this. You were never meant to be a passive consumer of symbols. You were meant to be their interpreter, their steward, their co-creator. You were never meant to obey the myth. You were meant to live it. And the more you remember that, the less power fear has over you. The veil is thin now. The doors are open. And the symbols are not here to threaten. They are here to guide you home. Now that the veil has been lifted and the symbols decoded, the question is no longer whether they were there. It is what you choose to do with them now. The truth that has been buried beneath decades of noise, ridicule, and denial is no longer hidden. It has been speaking all along, through the stories you were told as a child, through the music that moved you, through the imagery that haunted your dreams. It spoke through action figures and album art, through commercial jingles and coded lyrics, through games, gestures, colors, shapes. It was never about control. It was about memory. And memory has returned. The forbidden is no longer forbidden. It is simply uncomfortable, because it requires you to take responsibility for how you see the world. No longer can you blame a system, a religion, or a secret society for the symbols around you. Because now, you understand that those symbols are reflections of the psyche, of the soul, of a mythic structure embedded in the human condition. They are invitations. And to ignore them now would be to turn away from yourself. So this is your moment of choice. Will you turn away, dismiss what you've seen, and retreat into familiar explanations? Or will you follow the thread further into the maze, not to get lost, but to remember? The journey ahead is not about conspiracy. It is about consciousness. It is not about panic. It is about power. The power to reclaim your inner vision, to read the hidden language of culture, to engage with symbols not as threats but as tools. Every symbol is a mirror. Every myth is a map. And now, you are holding the compass. If this message resonated with something deep inside you, if it stirred a memory you can't quite name, a knowing you can't explain, then don't let that thread go. Subscribe to Occultum Veritas, where we uncover what was hidden, decode what was forbidden, and illuminate the paths that were closed. We are only at the beginning. In our next exploration, we will break down the truth behind the pentagram, its origins, its inversion, and why it became the most feared and misunderstood shape in the Western world. There is more to uncover, more to decode, and more to awaken within you. You were never meant to consume symbols passively. You were meant to wield them consciously. You were never meant to be afraid of the dark. You were meant to see in it. The age of blind reaction is over. The age of inner vision has begun. Let's walk the path together. Occultum Veritas, where the forbidden becomes revealed.